It was a warm evening in downtown Arlington. The bustling streets were filled with chatter and life as people darted in and out of cafes and shops. Marcus Reed, a decorated Navy SEAL on leave, strolled casually down the sidewalk, dressed in a simple gray shirt, well-fitted jeans, and sneakers. A leather messenger bag hung from his shoulder. He was heading to a local bookstore to pick up a novel he'd been meaning to read. His mind relaxed for the first time in months. Just as Marcus crossed an intersection, he heard the unmistakable sound of a police car pulling up. Tires screeched faintly as the car came to a halt. A white police officer, Officer Daniels, stepped out with a deliberate slowness, his sharp blue eyes scanning Marcus like a hawk sizing up its prey. "Hey you," Daniels barked, his voice cutting through the street noise. Marcus paused mid-step, turning his head to meet the officer's gaze. "You're in a bit of a hurry, aren't you?" Daniels continued, his tone dripping with unwarranted suspicion. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" The question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory, but Marcus remained calm. A few pedestrians slowed their pace, sensing tension, while others continued on, seemingly used to moments like this. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Just heading to the bookstore," he replied evenly. Daniels folded his arms, his lips curling into a smirk. "Bookstore, huh? That bag of yours, what's in it? You carrying anything I should know about?" The implication was clear, and Marcus felt the weight of the stares around him. He could already feel the itch of prejudice behind the officer's words. But instead of anger or frustration, something else flickered in Marcus's eyes, quiet confidence. "You want to check?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, almost challenging. Daniels straightened his posture, clearly not expecting that response. "I'll be the one asking questions," he snapped. A beat of silence passed as the officer's hand hovered near his utility belt. The crowd began to grow subtly thicker as more people stopped, phones discreetly emerging from pockets. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, still relaxed, but something about his presence made Daniels hesitate. And that's when Marcus spoke again, his tone as calm as before. "All right, officer, let's do this the right way." The growing crowd was starting to murmur, their curiosity piqued by the tension crackling in the air. Marcus's composure, unshaken by the officer's implied threat, seemed to unnerve Daniels. The officer squared his shoulders and moved a step closer, his boots clinking faintly against the pavement. "Drop the bag," Daniels demanded, his tone harsher now, as if raising his voice might mask his uncertainty. Marcus remained still, his expression unreadable. "Sure," he said after a moment, carefully removing the bag from his shoulder and holding it out. His calmness wasn't submission, it was strategy. As Daniels snatched the bag, Marcus's gaze remained fixed on him. There was no fear in those dark eyes, only a quiet power that seemed to unsettle the officer further. "Hands behind your back," Daniels barked, reaching for the cuffs on his belt. At this, Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his voice steady and unyielding. "You're being detained," Daniels shot back, avoiding the direct question. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like a bad joke. A few people in the crowd exchanged incredulous looks, and a woman holding a phone muttered, "Here we go again." Marcus gave a slow nod, his lips curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "All right, Officer Daniels. Let me help you out," he said, stepping closer but keeping his movements deliberate. Daniels stiffened, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "Stay right there." Marcus stopped, raising his hand slightly. "Relax, I'm just giving you my ID." He reached into his back pocket slowly and pulled out a small, sleek cardholder. From it, he extracted his military ID and handed it over. Daniels hesitated, glancing down at the card. His smirk faltered for the briefest moment as his eyes scanned the name, the rank, and the words United States Navy SEAL, etched onto the ID. "You still think I fit the description?" Marcus asked, his voice as calm as ever but now edged with subtle amusement. The crowd, sensing the shift, leaned in closer. Phones were now openly recording, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Daniels, clearly flustered, clenched his jaw and tossed the ID back to Marcus. "This doesn't mean you're above suspicion," he muttered. "Stay put while I check your bag." Marcus crossed his arms, a small smile playing on his lips. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes said enough. "Go ahead and try to dig yourself out of this hole." As Daniels unzipped the bag and began rummaging through its contents, Marcus took a small step back, his calm demeanor now laced with a quiet confidence that felt almost theatrical. Make sure to show everyone what you find, Marcus said, gesturing toward the growing audience. The tension in the air was almost palpable as Officer Daniels crouched slightly, pulling open the zipper of Marcus's leather messenger bag. The crowd leaned in, their phones trained on the scene like paparazzi catching a scandal. Daniels dug his hand inside, his expression a mix of forced confidence and concealed apprehension. Inside, the contents of Marcus's bag were tidy, as though arranged with military precision. A neatly folded book, a stainless steel water bottle, and a sleek black laptop sat side by side. Daniels hesitated for a moment, his fingers grazing the book before pulling it out. "What's this?" Daniels demanded, holding up the book as though it were contraband. The title, Leadership Under Pressure, A SEAL's Guide to Resilience and Excellence, was emblazoned across the front. The irony was lost on Daniels, but not on the murmuring crowd. Marcus's calm expression didn't waver. "That's a book I wrote," he said evenly, the faintest trace of amusement coloring his words. Daniels blinked, momentarily thrown off. "You wrote this?" he repeated, as though the idea were impossible. "That's what I said," Marcus replied, tilting his head slightly. "You want me to autograph it for you, or are you just planning to keep rummaging through my things?" A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd, and Daniels's face flushed red. He shoved the book back into the bag with more force than necessary, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Cut the attitude," he snapped, his tone more defensive now. "This isn't over." Marcus raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, you're the one making a scene," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge that made it clear he wasn't intimidated. "I'm just trying to go about my day." Daniels ignored the comment and continued rifling through the bag, pulling out the laptop next. He inspected it, as if expecting to find something incriminating. When that failed, he set it aside and moved to the last item, a small leather-bound journal. Opening it, Daniels flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing. The journal was filled with neat, precise handwriting, detailing Marcus's thoughts and experiences from deployments overseas. A particular entry caught Daniels's eye. "You don't fight for recognition. You fight because it's the right thing to do. Leadership isn't about power, it's about service." Daniels froze for a moment, the words clearly resonating on some level he wasn't ready to admit. The crowd, meanwhile, began to grow more restless. "Anything illegal in there, officer?" Marcus asked, his tone polite but laced with quiet challenge. Daniels slammed the journal shut and shoved it back into the bag, his frustration now plain on his face. "You're free to go," he barked, stepping back as though trying to regain his authority. Marcus didn't move. Instead, he crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "Not so fast," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You stopped me, accused me of fitting a description, rifled through my personal belongings in front of all these people. I think we're owed an explanation." The crowd erupted in agreement, voices calling out phrases like, "Yeah, what's the reason?" and "You can't just walk away from this." Phones were now pointed directly at Daniels, their owners waiting for his next move. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado now slipping under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. Marcus stood tall, calm, and unflinching, his mere presence making it impossible for the officer to brush this off. Officer Daniels's face was a mixture of frustration and unease as he glanced at the crowd surrounding him. The sheer number of phones recording his every move seemed to shrink the air around him. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a growing realization that he was now the one under scrutiny. Marcus, on the other hand, stood tall, his calm demeanor commanding the moment. He locked eyes with Daniels, the silence between them stretching out like a challenge. "You're not going to answer?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying effortlessly over the murmurs of the crowd. "What's this description I supposedly fit?" Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth was glaringly obvious to everyone watching. There had never been a description, just an excuse. "Let me guess," Marcus continued, his tone still calm but now tinged with sharpness. "Black man walking down the street, minding his own business. That about sums it up, doesn't it?" The crowd erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs, the tension building with every passing second. Daniels's jaw clenched as he struggled to find a response, but Marcus wasn't finished. "You see, officer," Marcus said, taking a step closer, "what you just did wasn't about keeping the streets safe. It was about power. You thought you could humiliate me, intimidate me, maybe even escalate this into something worse. But you didn't expect me to stay calm, did you? Daniels's face flushed red, but he remained silent. You didn't expect me to be a Navy SEAL, Marcus continued, his voice steady but piercing. You didn't expect me to have the discipline to stay level-headed or the experience to see through your game. The crowd was hanging on every word, some cheering softly, others nodding in agreement. Marcus turned slightly, addressing the growing audience. This isn't just about me, he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. It's about the countless times this happens to people who don't have a camera watching, who don't have the training or the platform to push back. This isn't justice, it's harassment, and it needs to stop. The crowd responded with applause, their voices rising in support. Daniels, now visibly rattled, tried to interject. I was just doing my job, he stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. Marcus turned back to him, his expression one of quiet disappointment. If this is how you define your job, maybe you're not cut out for it, he said simply. The words hit Daniels like a slap, and the crowd roared in agreement. People began calling out phrases like, hold him accountable, and file a complaint. Daniels looked around, his authority crumbling under the weight of public opinion. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up. Here's the deal, officer, he said. You're going to stand here in front of all these people and explain why you stopped me. Or he let the implication hang in the air as he tapped his phone screen. Daniels's eyes widened as he realized Marcus had been recording the entire interaction. The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. You don't owe me an apology, Marcus added, his voice cutting through the chaos. You owe every single person here an explanation for why you thought you could abuse your power. So go ahead, talk. The crowd fell silent, waiting for Daniels's response. The officer's face was pale now, his earlier arrogance completely drained away. He shifted on his feet, clearly panicking under the weight of the moment. The weight of the moment bore down on Officer Daniels like a storm cloud, the crowd's expectant silence amplifying his discomfort. Beads of sweat formed on his brow as he shifted his stance, searching for an escape from the corner he had backed himself into. Daniels stammered, his gaze darting between Marcus and the sea of recording phones. I was acting on suspicion. Just doing my duty, trying to ensure public safety. The crowd groaned, the flimsy excuse igniting murmurs of frustration and disbelief. A man near the front shook his head, muttering, same old story, while a woman called out, what suspicion, say it plainly. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his presence seemed to grow more commanding. He took a deliberate step closer, his calm gaze locking onto Daniels's flustered face. Suspicion, Marcus repeated, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Let me make this clear, officer. Suspicion is not a license to harass. It's not an excuse to stop someone without cause, and it's certainly not justification for targeting someone because of the color of their skin. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing him. The crowd cheered softly at the display of quiet authority. You want to talk about suspicion, Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly, his tone sharper now. What about the fact that you didn't ask anyone else on this street where they were going? What about the fact that you singled me out, rifled through my belongings, and tried to paint me as a threat, all without any evidence? Daniels's face turned red, his composure cracking under the intensity of Marcus's words. I wasn't singling you out, he sputtered, though his voice lacked conviction. Weren't you? Marcus shot back, his calm demeanor now tinged with righteous indignation. Because I don't see anyone else here being stopped. Or are you going to tell us all that they fit the same vague description you mentioned? The crowd erupted in support, some shouting, answer him, and we see right through you. Daniels looked like a cornered animal, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by desperation. He glanced at the crowd, at the phones capturing his every move, and then back at Marcus, who stood tall and unyielding. Marcus lowered his voice, his tone softening but losing none of its power. Here's the truth, Officer Daniels. You didn't expect me to push back. You thought you could get away with this because you've done it before, probably more times than you can count. But not today. Today you picked the wrong person. Daniels clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The crowd was fully against him now, their voices growing louder, their accusations cutting through the air like knives. "You still haven't explained why you stopped me," Marcus said, his voice calm but unrelenting. "And let me tell you what happens next. Either you give these people a real answer, or I make sure this video, and your name, gets the attention it deserves. Your call." Daniels's breath hitched, the reality of his situation sinking in. He looked around, his eyes filled with panic as he realized there was no way out without consequences. The crowd began chanting, "Accountability. Accountability." Phones were now pointed directly at Daniels, capturing every twitch of his face, every moment of his growing humiliation. Marcus stood silently, his steady gaze holding Daniels in place like a spotlight. He didn't need to say anything else. The power had shifted entirely into his hands. Daniels was visibly unraveling, his desperation leaking into every twitch of his face and every defensive shift of his posture. The crowd's chants of accountability echoed in his ears, drowning out his thoughts. He raised a hand to quiet them, but the gesture only fueled their frustration. "Enough," Daniels barked, his voice cracking slightly. He took a step forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You don't understand what it's like out here. We deal with criminals every day. We can't take chances." The crowd gasped at the officer's attempt to justify his actions, the tension thickening. A woman near the front shouted, "So you assume everyone who looks like him is a criminal?" The words cut through the crowd like a knife, her voice full of indignation. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Daniels with a mix of calm and disappointment. "So that's your excuse," he said, his voice low but cutting. "You profile people because it's easier than doing your job the right way." Daniels tried to regain his footing. "That's not what I said," he snapped. "I was doing my duty. He pointed at Marcus, his hand trembling slightly. "You were acting suspicious. That's why I stopped you." The crowd erupted into boos, voices calling out, "What was suspicious?" Walking down the street, "And we see what this is." Marcus stepped closer, his presence looming over Daniels now. "Acting suspicious," he repeated, his tone sharp. "Let's break this down. I was walking on a public street, minding my own business. That's suspicious. Or was it the color of my skin that made you stop me?" Daniels froze, his face pale now. He opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus didn't give him the chance. "You know what's really suspicious, Officer Daniels?" Marcus asked, his voice rising. "Someone who's sworn to serve and protect using their badge as a weapon against the people they're supposed to help. Someone who abuses their authority because they think no one will call them out. That's what's suspicious." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a tidal wave of support for Marcus. Daniels looked around, his eyes wide with panic. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone could see it. Realizing he was cornered, Daniels tried to salvage his crumbling authority. Look, I'll apologize, all right," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his own words. "This was a misunderstanding, let's just move on." But Marcus didn't let him off the hook. He raised a hand to silence the crowd, his commanding presence immediately restoring order. "An apology," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "You think this ends with an apology? You didn't just inconvenience me, officer. You disrespected me. You humiliated yourself. And you sent a message to everyone watching that this kind of behavior is acceptable. It's not." Daniels flinched at the words, his authority crumbling further with each passing second. The crowd, now fully on Marcus's side, waited to see what he would do next. Marcus turned to the crowd, his voice carrying with quiet power. "This isn't just about me," he said, addressing them directly. "It's about holding people accountable for their actions, especially those in positions of power. This ends when we stop tolerating it." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, their support for Marcus filling the air. Daniels looked around, his face pale, as he realized his reputation was irreparably damaged. The cheers and applause from the crowd felt like a tidal wave crashing down on Officer Daniels. He stood frozen, visibly shaken, as Marcus turned back to him, his calm but unrelenting gaze piercing through the chaos. "Let me make something clear, Officer Daniels," Marcus began, his voice steady and firm. "What you did here today wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to stop me without cause. You chose to treat me like a suspect without evidence, and now you're going to face the consequences of that choice." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat as Marcus held up his phone. The screen displayed the recording of their entire encounter, the video still rolling. "This is going online," Marcus said, his voice carrying with quiet authority. "And it's not just going to show what you did to me. It's going to show everyone exactly how you abuse your power, how you target people based on nothing more than your own bias." The crowd roared in approval, their voices rising in a collective call for justice. Daniels's face turned a deep shade of red, his earlier arrogance now replaced by panic. Wait, Daniels stammered, holding up his hands. "There's no need for that. Let's work this out. I'll make it right, okay?" Marcus's expression didn't waver. "Make it right," he repeated. "You think a half-hearted apology is enough to undo the damage you've done? You didn't just wrong me, you wronged every single person who's ever been profiled, harassed, or mistreated because of people like you." The crowd erupted into cheers and shouts of agreement. Marcus turned to address them, his voice calm but commanding. "This isn't just about one bad cop," he said, gesturing toward Daniels. "It's about a system that allows people like him to operate without accountability. That ends today. We've got the power to shine a light on this, to make sure that people like Officer Daniels can't get away with this anymore." The crowd cheered louder, their phones raised high as they recorded every word. Daniels looked around, his panic mounting as he realized there was no escaping the consequences. Marcus turned back to him, his tone softening but losing none of its edge. "You're not above the law, Daniels. You wear that badge, but you're supposed to serve and protect, not harass and intimidate. If you want to keep that badge, you're going to have to earn it back." Daniels stared at him, his mouth working soundlessly as he struggled to find a response. The weight of the moment had finally crushed his arrogance, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Before Daniels could say anything, Marcus took a step back and addressed the crowd once more. "This video will do the talking," he said. "And when it does, people will see the truth. They'll see what happens when we stand up and hold people accountable." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a thunderous wave of support. Daniels stood frozen, his authority shattered, as Marcus turned and began walking away, his head held high. But Marcus wasn't finished yet. He paused, turning back to Daniels one last time. "You've got a choice now," he said, his voice low but powerful. "You can keep walking this path or you can change, but if you stay the same, know this, people like me won't let you get away with it anymore." The words hung in the air like a final judgment, their weight undeniable. Daniels looked at Marcus, his face pale, as the crowd continued to chant for accountability. As Marcus walked away, the energy in the air shifted. The crowd, still buzzing with excitement and indignation, turned their focus on Officer Daniels. Their phones remained raised, their voices calling out demands for accountability. Daniels stood frozen, his face a mixture of anger, shame, and uncertainty. "Post that video," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. Others quickly joined in, chanting, "Post it, post it." Daniels turned toward the group, his earlier bravado replaced with a desperate need to salvage what little authority he had left. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, raising his hands as if to calm them. "You're all blowing this out of proportion." But the crowd wasn't buying it. A man near the front, wearing a navy blue suit, stepped forward. His tone was sharp and clear as he said, "Blowing it out of proportion. You targeted that man for no reason, embarrassed yourself in front of all of us, and now you want us to pretend it didn't happen." The man, who introduced himself as Marcus Wright, a civil rights attorney, addressed the crowd. "If anyone has footage of what happened here today, send it to me. This isn't just about one officer's behavior, it's about systemic accountability." Daniels paled further, his eyes darting nervously as people began murmuring in agreement. The lawyer's calm yet assertive demeanor mirrored Marcus Reed's earlier stance, amplifying the crowd's energy and resolve. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed hadn't gone far. He stood across the street, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. A small group of people approached him, offering their support and expressing their admiration. "Thank you for standing up to him," one woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's so rare to see someone handle it the way you did." Marcus smiled faintly, nodding. "It's not about me," he said simply. "It's about making sure this doesn't keep happening." Back at the scene, Daniels's attempts to pacify the crowd were failing spectacularly. people began recounting their own experiences with racial profiling and police harassment, their voices growing louder with each story. The tension wasn't dissipating, it was building into a unified call for action. A local news reporter, drawn by the commotion, arrived with a cameraman in tow. She pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand, and asked loudly, "What's going on here? Can someone explain the situation?" Marcus Wright stepped forward, his voice firm and clear. "What's going on," he said, pointing toward Daniels, "is an officer abusing his power and being called out for it. And we have the evidence to back it up." The reporter's eyes lit up with interest. "Do you have footage?" "Plenty," Marcus Wright replied, gesturing to the crowd, "and it's all going to be sent to the appropriate authorities." Daniels's face turned ghostly white as he realized the full gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a crowd anymore, it was a movement, one fueled by anger, justice, and the undeniable truth captured on dozens of phones. Across the street, Marcus Reed watched with a sense of quiet pride. He knew this was bigger than him now. His calm, strategic handling of the situation had sparked something much larger, a demand for change that couldn't be ignored. The crowd's energy reached a fever pitch as the reporter continued gathering statements, and Daniels looked more and more like a man who had lost all control. His hand hovered near his radio as if calling for backup might somehow undo the damage, but Marcus Wright's voice rang out again, silencing any hope Daniels might have had. "This isn't going away, officer," he said, "and neither are we." The momentum of the crowd had become unstoppable, their collective demand for accountability now echoing through the streets. Officer Daniels stood at the center of it all, his earlier arrogance crushed under the weight of public scrutiny. His face, once red with anger, was now pale as the crowd's chants of justice grew louder. The local news reporter, sensing the gravity of the moment, focused her camera on Daniels. "Officer, would you care to comment on the allegations of racial profiling and abuse of power?" she asked, her tone sharp. Daniels stammered, his words incoherent as he tried to form a response. I was just following protocol," he muttered weakly, but the crowd erupted in disbelief. "Protocol?" shouted a voice from the back. "What protocol lets you harass a man for walking down the street?" Marcus Wright, the civil rights attorney, stepped forward again. "You claim protocol, but we've all seen the truth," he said, gesturing toward the phones raised high in the crowd. "You stopped a man with no justification, searched his belongings, and tried to intimidate him. That's not protocol, that's prejudice." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus Reed's calm, commanding voice cut through the noise from across the street. "He's not going to admit it," Reed said, walking back toward the scene. The crowd parted for him as if by instinct, their attention now focused entirely on him. Reed's presence was magnetic, his composed demeanor silencing the crowd as he stopped a few feet from Daniels. "We've got everything we need," he said, holding up his phone. "The video, the witnesses, the truth, it's all here. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Daniels stared at Marcus, his face a mix of fear and defiance. I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying the man before him. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice calm but piercing. "Or a pattern, because something tells me this isn't the first time you've done this. The only difference is today you got caught." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder as the weight of Marcus's words settled over the scene. The local reporter, still filming, leaned into the moment. "Officer, are you willing to apologize publicly for your actions today?" she asked, her tone unrelenting. Daniels hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his situation. He glanced at the cameras, the crowd, and finally at Marcus, who stood unwavering. With a heavy sigh, he muttered, "I'm sorry. I made a bad call." The apology was weak, but it was enough to draw a mixture of relief and skepticism from the crowd. Marcus didn't let up, though. "Words are easy, Officer Daniels," he said, his voice firm. "Action is harder. You owe more than an apology, you owe accountability, and it starts with you owning what you did here today." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in support of Marcus's unwavering stance. Daniels, cornered and defeated, nodded stiffly. "Fine," he said. I'll file a report on myself." The words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed like the crowd might accept it. But Marcus, ever the strategist, wasn't satisfied. "That's a start," he said, "but it's not enough. This video is going to the precinct, to the press, and to every platform I can find. People need to see what happens when power goes unchecked. Daniels's face fell further as the crowd roared their agreement. The reporter turned her camera back to Marcus, her eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Reed," she said, "you've turned this moment into something much larger. What's your next step?" Marcus glanced at her, then at the crowd. "The next step is systemic change," he said. "We need more than apologies. We need accountability, training, and consequences for actions like this, and I won't stop until that happens." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices a unified call for justice. Daniels stood silently, his authority shattered, as Marcus turned back to him one last time. "You're going to learn something today, Daniels," Marcus said, his voice low but powerful. "Actions have consequences, and thanks to all these people, yours are just beginning." The crowd's cheers filled the air, their energy electric as Marcus Reed stood tall in the middle of it all. Officer Daniels looked utterly defeated, his head lowered as the reality of his situation sank in. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about something much larger. The local reporter, still filming, turned her attention back to Marcus. "Mr. Reed, your actions here today have sparked something powerful," she said. "What message do you want people to take away from this?" Marcus paused, glancing at the sea of faces around him. Each one represented someone who had been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated. His voice, steady and deliberate, carried across the crowd. "The message," he began, "is that accountability isn't optional, it's necessary. No one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. And if we want real change, we have to stand together, speak out, and demand it. Today isn't the end of this fight, it's just the beginning." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices a chorus of support. Marcus Wright, the civil rights attorney, stepped forward and placed a hand on Reed's shoulder. "Let's make sure this momentum doesn't fade," he said. "This video and these witnesses can spark real change, but only if we keep pushing." Together, the two Marcuses, Reed, the Navy SEAL, and Wright, the attorney, united their efforts to ensure that Officer Daniels's actions wouldn't be swept under the rug. The video, already spreading online, became a rallying cry for justice and accountability. Within hours, it trended on social media, drawing attention from activists, lawmakers, and news outlets across the country. Daniels, unable to escape the mounting pressure, was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. His weak apology and years of unchecked behavior came under intense scrutiny. For him, this was the beginning of a reckoning that would force him to confront the consequences of his actions. But for Marcus Reed, this moment wasn't about personal vindication, it was about the community. He used the platform created by the viral video to advocate for police reform, focusing on mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and community accountability measures. Weeks later, at a public forum held in the same city, Marcus stood before an even larger crowd. Community leaders, activists, and local officials had gathered to discuss tangible steps toward change. Reed's calm, commanding voice echoed through the room. "Today, we're taking a step forward," he said, "not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or targeted. Change doesn't come easy, but it starts here with all of us." The crowd rose to its feet, their applause thunderous and unwavering. Marcus's actions that day had sparked something greater, a movement built on resilience, unity, and the unwavering demand for justice. And as he stood at the forefront of that movement, Marcus Reed knew one thing for certain: the fight for accountability wasn't over. But with every step forward, every voice raised, and every action taken, they were moving closer to a world where justice wasn't just a word, it was a promise. The end.